She wore silk gloves and danced with the sons of senators. He wore leather work gloves with holes in the palms and never danced at all. She thought she knew what love was supposed to feel like. Then her hands blistered. Then they hardened. And somewhere between the biscuits and the barn chores and the wildflowers left on the kitchen table with no note attached, she stopped looking for the love she expected and found the love she actually needed. This is a channel for stories that don't shout stories about the West, about motherhood, about compassion and quiet devotion, about the kind of love that outlasts everything else. What this story gives you: a gentle nudge to look around at your own life, because someone may already be loving you in a language you haven't learnt to read yet. Subscribe so you never miss a story. Share this one with someone who deserves to hear it. And if it moved you, a like means more than you know.
Nobody stepped forward to greet her. She had the photograph of him memorized, with his square jaw and tired eyes. His letter promised he would be waiting right here. That letter had promised all sorts of things. A man finally emerged from the shadows of the general store. He was tall, burned dark by the sun, with his hat pulled down low. He walked her way, taking his sweet time, and stopped about 3 feet from her. His eyes went straight to her trunk. "Miss Ashford." "Yes, you must be him." He hefted the trunk, turned his back, and started walking toward an old buckboard wagon down the way. There was no handshake, no smile, not even a tip of his hat. Clara was left standing all alone in the dust. Her gloved hand was still held out, reaching for absolutely nothing. Based on our channel data, it seems nearly 60% of y'all watching have not yet subscribed or liked the story. If this tale has struck a chord in your heart, we would surely appreciate your support. It helps us share more stories like this one with good folks who enjoy them. Thank you for being here with us. 6 long hours on that wagon. Clara's back was aching something fierce against the hard wooden seat. Her throat felt as dry as a creek bed in August, but she never asked for water. The canvas water bag hung from a hook right by his arm, but he never offered her a sip. She tried to make conversation 2, then 3 times. His replies were just grunts and short words. After her 4th try, she finally gave up. The sun made its slow journey across the big sky and dipped behind the western hills. The ranch house finally came into view in the dim purple light. It was just 4 walls, a tin roof, and a porch holding a single rocking chair. Silas hauled her trunk inside without saying a thing. The door hinges cried out as Clara stepped over the threshold and froze. There was a cast-iron stove, a table made from rough-cut wood, 2 chairs that were not a matching set, and bare walls with bare windows. There were no curtains, no pictures, and no flowers to be seen. The whole place had the smell of wood smoke and something else, a deep kind of emptiness. It was the kind of lonely that works its way into the floorboards when a house has not heard laughter in a very long time. She unpacked her things slowly, pulling out silk ribbons, a silver-backed hand mirror, and a leather-bound book of Tennyson's poems. She placed the mirror on the windowsill where it caught the last bit of daylight and threw a bright square onto the plain wall. Everything looked foolish and out of place, like wearing fancy jewelry on a body that had no life left in it. Silas appeared in the doorway. He gestured with his head toward a small room off the main one. "The bedroom is in there. I will be sleeping in the barn." He rubbed the back of his neck and was gone before the door even clicked shut. Clara tried to make supper. She fixed beans and biscuits and she burned them both. The beans formed a black crust stuck hard to the bottom of the pot. The biscuits turned out as heavy as stones from the river. She put his plate on the table and watched him eat every last bite. He did not frown, and he did not say a word about it. "Thank you," he said, but only after his plate was completely clean. Just those 2 words. Then she heard the scrape of his chair, the clink of his plate in the wash basin, and the sound of the door opening and closing. He was gone. Clara sat by herself at the table. The coal oil lamp hissed and its flame danced. Shadows grew in every corner of the room. She counted the knots in the wooden planks. There were 7 of them. She counted them all over again. Outside, a soft yellow light appeared in the barn window. He was still up. He was just 20 feet away. She pressed the flat of her hand against the cold window pane and just stared at that faraway light until her own hand felt cold and numb. What sort of man could eat burned beans without so much as a flinch, but could not bring himself to look his own wife in the eye? The days started to run together. Every morning Clara would wake up to the smell of coffee that was already brewed. The stove would be warm, and the front door would be propped open to the cool morning air. Silas was always long gone by the time her bare feet hit the cold floorboards. She would watch him from the window as he mended the split-rail fence that ran along the north pasture. She saw him haul water from the creek in big wooden buckets that left dark, wet lines in the dirt. He would check the hooves of the bay mare, lifting one leg at a time, with the patience of a stone. He moved with a natural rhythm, like a man who had been doing these jobs all by himself for years and years. There was never a wasted movement, never a moment of doubt. She started to notice his hands. They were large and calloused, with knuckles that were scarred and darkened by the sun. He handled his tools the same way other men might handle a deck of playing cards, with a certainty that was quick and familiar. One morning, a racket in the corral drew her out onto the porch. A young colt, a chestnut-colored one about a year old, was pacing along the fence line. Its eyes were wild and its ears were pinned back flat. It kicked hard at the wooden rails when Clara took a step closer, so she stopped right where she was. Silas came around from behind the barn. He did not even glance her way. He simply opened the corral gate and walked inside. He did not have a rope or a whip or anything at all in his hands. He just stood there, perfectly still with his palms open by his sides. The colt snorted and circled him, its hooves kicking up little puffs of dust. It tossed its head, showing the whites of its scared eyes. Silas did not budge. The colt circled him again, but slower this time. Its ears flicked forward and then back, then forward again as it watched Silas, just waiting. Long minutes ticked by. Clara's fingers tightened their grip on the porch railing. The morning sun climbed up into the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed twice. The colt finally stopped moving. It stood about 10 feet away from Silas. Its sides were rising and falling fast, and its nostrils were flared wide. Then it took one step, and then another. It stretched its neck out toward him, the muscles shaking beneath its dusty hide. Silas lifted one hand so slowly it looked like he was moving it through deep water. His palm came to rest on the colt's neck. He stroked it once, then twice. The colt's head lowered. Its entire body seemed to let out a long, slow breath. Clara felt her own breath catch in her throat. Those hands, the very same hands that had not touched her even once since the day she arrived, looked as rough as old tree bark against that trembling neck. But they were as gentle as anything she had ever witnessed. The very next morning, she did not stay inside and watch from the window. She found a bucket sitting by the door to the hen house, and she picked it up. Silas looked over at her, then his eyes went to the bucket. His eyebrows went up about 1/4 of an inch, which was the most expression she had seen on his face in 2 weeks. He took the bucket right out of her hands. He showed her how to hold it low against her hip so the chickens could not knock it over when they all rushed out for their feed. He did not scold her, and he did not sigh with impatience. He just simply moved her hands to the right spot, and then he stepped away. The feed trough was the next lesson. She learned to feel for rust along the bottom edge, where water liked to pool and eat away at the metal. The hand pump needed 3 good hard pulls before the water finally came out clear. She learned that the sky could tell you things, if you just knew how to read it. Clouds piling up in the west meant rain would be coming by nightfall. Clouds that were moving fast and flat just meant wind and nothing more. Silas taught her all of these things without using any words. He would give her a nod when she did something right, and a slow shake of his head when she did not. He never once snatched a tool from her hands or rolled his eyes at her. He would just wait for her to figure it out herself, and then they would move on to whatever was next. Her palms got blisters, and then the blisters turned into calluses. The blisters had hurt quite a bit. The calluses did not. By the time the second week was over, her biscuits no longer looked like rocks from the river. One evening, Silas took a second helping. He did not say anything about it, but he took them. One evening, Clara came inside to get supper started, and she stopped dead in the doorway. There were wildflowers sitting on the kitchen table, purple sage and yellow columbine. A little bit of dirt was still clinging to their roots. The stems were wrapped up in a piece of wet burlap and were propped up against the salt cellar. There was no note and no ribbon, just the flowers. They were plain and simple, looking like someone had just plucked them from the ground 5 minutes before. The barn door was already shut for the night, and the lamp inside was already glowing. Clara walked over to the table and touched a petal with the tip of her finger. It felt soft, and it was still cool from the shady spot where it had grown. Her mother's voice came to her then, rising up from some deep place in her memory. "Watch what a man does, child. Any fool can talk pretty." She found an old tin cup in the cupboard and filled it up with water from the pump. She arranged the flowers inside. It was a clumsy job, with the stems too long and the cup too narrow, but she set it on the windowsill where the morning sun would be sure to find them. Then she sat herself down at the table with a pen and some paper. She began to write a letter to her sister Catherine back in New York, and it ended up being 4 pages long. She told Catherine all about the long journey and the dust. "It is a terrible injustice when a good man is so buried in grief he cannot speak, and a brave woman is the underdog who must learn his silent language to survive." Clara knew this man communicated through hot coffee, uneven curtains, and bunches of wildflowers he would leave for her, wrapped in rough burlap. She folded her letter to Catherine and slipped it into an envelope, writing the address with her steady hand. But she never sent it. For 3 days, then a full week, the letter sat on a shelf next to her poetry book. Sometimes she would just look at it, pick it up, and then set it back down. If she mailed it, Catherine would surely write back with questions. She would ask if Clara was happy, if this whole thing had been a mistake, if she wanted to pack her bags and come home. Clara had no idea how to answer. She was too busy learning a new language. The words were strange things like heavy buckets and painful blisters, and the smell of purple sage in a tin cup. But she was slowly starting to understand the grammar of it all. On the morning of her 3rd week, Clara woke long before the sun. She got dressed in the quiet dark, pulled on the ugly practical brown leather work boots she bought in town, and walked straight out to the corral. Silas was already there, brushing down his bay mare. He glanced up as she came near, his eyes flicking down to her new boots, then back up to her face. Something in his expression changed. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen on his face. He held the brush out to her. She reached out and took it. For just a moment, their fingers touched, her rough skin against his rough skin, her new calluses against his old ones. Then he took a step back, giving her space to work. The sun finally crested over the eastern ridge. Its light touched the barn roof first, then the wooden corral fence, and then the mare's rich chestnut coat. Clara ran the brush along the horse's side, feeling the big animal lean into the steady pressure. She never heard him leave, but when she turned around, Silas was gone. The big barn door was wide open, and sitting on the fence post right beside her, placed where she absolutely could not miss it, was a pair of worn leather work gloves. They were far too big for her hands, but she put them on anyway. A new rhythm started to form, slow and steady. Clara taught herself to wake up before the sky was fully light. She learned which floorboard creaked. The third one? The one that groaned if you put your weight on it the wrong way. She learned how to move like a shadow through the dark kitchen, feeling her way to the coffee pot, the tin cups, and the box of matches kept beside the stove. Silas still got up earlier, but now when she came outside, the coffee cup warming her hands, he would give her one quick nod before turning back to whatever job he had already started. By the 6th week, she could read his silences like she used to read sheet music. A short grunt from him meant something was good. A long breath out through his nose meant it was not quite right. A single, tiny shake of his head, so small you could almost miss it, meant, "Stop now before you hurt yourself." And that one rare nod, the kind that came with direct eye contact, was his version of praise. She learned to read the land, too. She figured out which pasture stayed in the morning shade the longest, and where the creek was shallow enough to cross without getting her boots soaked. She saw how the cattle would bunch up tight before a storm, with their heads down and their tails turned against the wind. Her mornings were for the hen house and the butter churn. The wooden dasher moved up and down in her hands. She would pull and release until her shoulders ached and the cream finally turned into thick, pale yellow butter. In the afternoon, she worked wherever Silas was, not getting in his way, just staying close. She would hand him nails as he fixed the barn door, or hold the mare's bridle while he checked the horse's shoes. She was learning the weight of a silence that was not empty at all. Their suppers began to change. They were still quiet, but now Silas would look up when she put his plate down, meeting her eyes for a split second before looking back at his food. He started taking a second helping of her biscuits without her having to ask. One time she saw him scraping the very last bit of gravy from his plate with a piece of bread. He said nothing about it, but he wiped that plate completely clean. The wagon showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, 6 weeks and 3 days after Clara had first stepped off the stagecoach in this dusty place called Sagebrush Hollow. She heard it before she saw it, that rattle of wheels on the dry dirt road and the jingle of a horse's harness. She walked out onto the porch, using her hand to shield her eyes from the bright afternoon sun. A woman was sitting on the wagon seat with a round face and gray hair pulled back in a faded bonnet. She waved her arm high in the air as if she were trying to stop a speeding train. "Hello there," she called out. "You must be the new Mrs. Drifter." Clara's hand instinctively grabbed the porch railing for support. She had not thought of herself in that way. Not once. The woman climbed down from the wagon much faster than you would expect for her size. A man followed her, tall and skinny as a fence post, moving slowly and carefully, as if every joint in his body ached. "Martha Holloway," the woman said, taking Clara's hand in both of hers and shaking it twice. "And that there is Ezra. Pay him no mind. He does not talk much." And she leaned in close and whispered loudly, "Seems like you got the same kind of problem right here." "I am Clara. Please come inside. I will make some coffee." Martha Holloway talked enough for 4 people. She sat down in a kitchen chair as if she had owned it for 20 years. Her eyes darted around the room, noticing the wildflowers on the windowsill, the fact there were still no curtains, and the bare walls that Clara had not yet figured out how to make feel like a home. "Lord have mercy," Martha declared. "This place needs a woman's touch, and it needs it something fierce." She gave Clara's arm a comforting pat. "It is a good thing you showed up when you did." Ezra sat quietly by the stove and did not say a word. He had kind eyes, though. He gave Clara a single nod and then seemed happy to let his wife do all the talking. And Martha talked plenty. She explained that the community had church get-togethers once a month over at the Fenton's place 8 miles to the south. Barn raisings happened whenever somebody needed one, and it seemed someone always needed one. She said Mrs. Patterson made the best apple pie in 3 whole counties but would not share the recipe with a soul, not even on her deathbed, which was both a sin and a crying shame. "Folks look out for each other around here," Martha said. "We have to. The closest real town is 40 miles away, and the nearest doctor is 60. If you get into real trouble out here, it is your neighbors who come to save you, or nobody saves you at all." Clara poured them both more coffee. "How long have you known Silas?" she asked. Martha's whole face changed, softening around the edges. "Since he was just a little boy, running barefoot all over these fields. I watched him grow up right here on this land." She held her warm cup with both hands. His folks were good people, Henry and Ruth. The salt of the earth, both of them. A fever took them 3 years back. It swept through this whole valley that summer, but it hit this ranch the very hardest. Martha slowly shook her head. Ruth passed on first. Henry followed her just 4 days later. He could not live without her. I reckon some men are just built that way. A lump formed in Clara's throat. Silas had never said a word about any of it. "He would not," Martha said, setting her cup down. Bless his heart, that man would not complain if his own boots were on fire. He buried them himself. Both of them. He did not ask for any help, and he did not want it. He just dug the holes under that big cottonwood tree out back and then got on with living. She paused for a moment. If you can call what he was doing living. Ezra finally spoke for the very first time. He said 2 words, as quiet as leaves falling from a tree. "Good man." Martha nodded in agreement. "The best kind. The quiet kind. The kind of man who shows up whenever you need him and never asks for a single thing in return." Her sharp eyes focused on Clara. "I told Ezra when we heard he had sent for a bride, I said, that girl has either got grit or she has got nothing at all. And looking at you now, sitting right here with calluses on your hands and dirt under your fingernails," she smiled. "Well, it sure looks like grit to me." Clara looked down at her own hands. Martha was right. The calluses were thick and the skin was tan from the sun. These were not the hands of a woman who once danced at fancy balls and wore silk gloves to afternoon tea. "You want my advice?" Martha asked, leaning forward. "Do not try to fix him. Just stand right next to him. If you stand there long enough, he will fix himself." They left about an hour later. Martha hugged Clara like they had been friends for decades. Ezra gave her hand one firm, quick shake and said nothing more. "You need anything?" Martha called out from the wagon seat. "You just send word. We are 5 miles east of here, right past the creek with the bent cottonwood tree." Clara stood and watched them go. The dust from the wagon wheels slowly settled back onto the road. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty yard. She stood there for a very long time, thinking about a young man digging 2 graves all by himself, filling them in all by himself, and then walking back to an empty house, all by himself. 3 years of that silence. 3 years of eating every meal at a table that was built for 2, but with only 1 chair ever being used. That evening, Clara made coffee. She made it strong and black, just the way he drank it. She carried the steaming cup across the yard. The barn door was open, and the warm light from a lantern spilled out onto the hard, packed dirt. She could hear him moving around inside, the steady sound of a brush against a horse's hide, and the soft noises of the mare shifting her weight. Clara took a breath and stepped through the doorway. Silas looked up, the brush stopping in midair. His eyebrows raised just a tiny bit. She placed the coffee cup on a bale of hay that was right next to his elbow. Then she turned and started to walk back to the house. His voice stopped her just as she reached the door. "Clara." It was just her name, nothing more. But there was something in the way he said it. It was not flat or empty. There was something else underneath it, something she could not quite put a name to. She turned her head slightly, but she did not look all the way back at him. "Yes?" There was a pause, just long enough for the mare to snort and stamp one of its hooves. "The coffee is good." Clara gave a single nod, then walked out into the cooling night air, crossed the yard, and climbed the steps to the porch. Her hands were shaking when she finally got back into the kitchen. She pressed them flat against the cool edge of the stove and just stood there, staring at her own reflection in the dark window pane. She was smiling, and she could not for the life of her remember when she had started. Clara lay wide-eyed on the crackling corn-husk mattress, listening to the stillness of the homestead. The quiet felt different now, not so empty. It felt like a space holding its breath, just waiting. He had spoken her name the very first time since her arrival. She laid a hand flat on her chest, feeling the heavy thump of her own heart. What other secrets were buried in all that silence? The fever ambushed her on a Thursday morning. Clara woke to a hammer pounding inside her skull and skin that was hot as a skillet. She tried to get to her feet, but the room decided to lurch sideways. She clung to the bedpost, waiting for the walls to settle down. Just a chill, she told herself, just plain worn out. Her body was finally protesting weeks of labor it was never meant for. She somehow made it to the kitchen and got the coffee started. Her hands trembled so fiercely the ground scattered over the stovetop like a flurry of black dust. She brushed them away with clumsy fingers and began again. An hour later, Silas discovered her collapsed against the kitchen table. She recognized the sound of his heavy boots on the wood floors, and then felt his calloused, warm hand press against her forehead. He made a low noise deep in his throat. Not quite a word, something more primal. The next thing she knew, his strong arms were scooping her up, carrying her as the ceiling beams paraded slowly overhead. She saw the bedroom doorway, then the corn-husk mattress came up to meet her back. "Stay," he commanded. It was a single word, an order. She was too weak to even think about arguing. The following 4 days dissolved into a blur, like a painting left in a hard rain. Clara drifted between consciousness and nothing at all. At times the room was filled with the sharp, bright slant of afternoon sun through the bare window. Other times it was swallowed by darkness, with the coal oil lamp on the bedside table flickering, casting shadows that leaped and danced with every gust of wind that whistled through the walls. But every single time she managed to open her eyes, Silas was there. He sat in a ladder-back chair he had pulled up close to the bed, his hat finally off his head. His brown hair was longer than she had thought, and it fell in unkempt tangles across his brow. He was holding a bowl. Thin white curls of steam rose from it. "Broth," he stated plainly. "Drink." So she drank the chicken broth, salty and hot and deeply comforting. It stung her throat on the way down, but she didn't mind one bit. Her throat had become so parched she had nearly forgotten the feeling of swallowing. A cool cloth simply appeared on her forehead. She never saw him dip it in the basin of water. She never saw him wring it out. And yet there it was, damp and blessedly cold against her burning skin. The relief was so immediate and overwhelming that it made her eyes burn with tears. When the cloth grew warm, he would replace it, over and over and over. Sometime in the dead of that first night, Clara woke to the sound of his voice, low and gravelly, and out of practice. He was reading from a book, a leather-bound volume with its cover worn soft at the edges and a spine cracked with age. It was his mother's Bible. Clara knew it from the shelf where it had remained untouched since the day she came. "The Lord is my shepherd," he read, his voice stumbling over the cadence of the words. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth." He stopped for a moment. He tried the word again. "He restoreth my soul." His voice hitched on that final word. He cleared his throat and simply continued, turning page after page, reciting psalm after psalm. The verses washed over Clara, like a gentle creek flowing over river stones, smoothing her sharp edges, filling in the cracks, and washing away the things that did not need to be there anymore. She let her eyes close and allowed herself to float on the sound. She could not tell if he was reading for her benefit or for his own. It truly did not matter. On the morning of the 5th day, the fever finally broke. Clara opened her eyes to the soft gray light of dawn, and a mind that was perfectly clear. Her body ached as if a herd of cattle had run over her, but the searing heat was gone. The room held steady when she turned her head. The walls did not lean. Silas was asleep in the chair, his chin dropped to his chest. The open Bible was resting in his lap. One of his hands was still pressed against the thin pages, as though he had drifted off in the middle of a verse. Dark smudges of exhaustion shadowed the skin beneath his eyes. A rough stubble covered his jaw. A good 4 days' worth, maybe even 5. He had not left her side, not for a single moment. Not to do his chores, not to eat his meals, not for any real sleep that was not snatched in a hard, straight-back chair next to her bed. Clara just watched him breathe, a slow and steady rhythm. She watched his chest rise and fall under the worn, faded cotton of his work shirt. A tightness formed in her throat. She turned her head to face the wall, blinking fiercely until the stinging in her eyes went away. When she looked back again, his eyes were open, and he was watching her. "Better?" he asked. His voice was hoarse. scraped completely raw from reading aloud through 4 very long nights. When she nodded, he nodded back once, then stood. His knees cracked loudly in the silent room, the distinct sound of joints that had been kept bent for far too long. He placed the Bible carefully on the bedside table and then walked out of the room without saying another word. Clara heard the front door open, the sound of his boots on the porch, and then the barn door groaning on its old hinges. She lay there for a good long while, her hand resting on the worn leather cover of his mother's Bible. The next morning, she discovered she could stand up without the room spinning around her. She got dressed with deliberate slowness. Each small movement seemed to take a toll. Her legs felt like they were on loan from someone else, wobbly and unreliable. But she managed to reach the bedroom door, push it open, and then she froze right where she stood. There were curtains hanging in the windows. They were made of a rough cotton fabric, a faded blue, the color of a work shirt that had been washed 100 times. The hems were crooked, obviously cut with shears made for trimming leather and stitched by hands far more accustomed to mending a horse's harness than sewing cloth. One panel hung a full inch longer than its partner. Clara walked across the room and touched the material. It was surprisingly soft from having been washed. Someone had laundered it before putting it up. Someone had actually taken the time to consider that. Her gaze shifted to the windowsill. A jar of wildflowers was sitting there, purple sage and yellow columbine, just like the ones from before, but these were fresh. The water in the jar was still perfectly clear. The petals had not even started to wilt. She turned and looked toward the bedroom. A small shelf had been nailed to the wall right beside the headboard. It was raw wood, but the edges had been sanded down smooth so it would not catch or cause a splinter. It was just wide enough to hold 3 or 4 books. Her own volume of Tennyson was already sitting there, its spine facing outward, placed with obvious care. Silas was standing in the kitchen doorway, his hands hanging limp at his sides. He was not looking at her. He was staring at the floor, at the dust motes dancing in the morning sun, at absolutely anything but her face. The very tips of his ears had turned a deep red. "Don't fit right." His voice came out raspy and defensive. "The curtains. I can take them down. Redo them if you want. They are perfect." He cleared his throat. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He rubbed the back of his neck with a calloused hand. "The shelf, too. If it is not level, I can fix it. It is perfect." He gave a single nod, sharp and quick. Then he turned on his heel and walked right out. The door slammed shut behind him. His boots sounded on the porch, fast, almost like he was running. Clara was left standing alone in the kitchen, her hands still resting against the soft fabric of the uneven curtains. Her chest hurt, but it was not from the fever. It was from something else entirely, an ache that had nothing to do with being sick. That evening, they sat across from each other at the table. The low flame of the coal oil lamp flickered between them. Clara's hands were wrapped around a cup of coffee that she had not even sipped. Silas was staring at a point somewhere over her left shoulder, his jaw set tight, his fingers tapping out a slow, restless beat on the tabletop. The quiet stretched out, but it was a new kind of quiet now, one that was filled with all the things that were pushing to be said. Clara was the one who spoke first. "Will you tell me about them? Your parents?" Silas's jaw clenched even tighter. A muscle twitched under the stubble on his cheek. For a long, heavy moment, she was sure he was not going to answer. She thought she had pushed too hard, had asked for something he was not willing to give, and had broken something delicate that was only just beginning to grow between them. Then, slow and heavy like a stone sinking in a deep well, the words finally came. "Pa taught me to work." He paused. The lamplight wavered. A moth fluttered against the hot glass chimney. "Ma taught me to pray." He paused again, this time for longer. His fingers stopped their nervous drumming. They went quick. That much was something. The fever took them both in less than a week. Some folks will hang on for months. They did not. He stopped speaking. He swallowed hard. She watched his Adam's apple move in his throat, buried them under the cottonwood, Out back. His voice got so low that Clara had to lean in to catch the words. Ma, she liked that tree. She used to sit under it in the evenings after the work was all done. He said the leaves sounded like water running over rocks. He fell silent then. His hands were lying flat on the table, palms down, his fingers spread wide. The knuckles had turned bone white from how hard he was pressing down. Clara's hand reached out, covering his own in the quiet space between them. She could feel the rough calluses, the faint lines of old scars, and a tension that ran through him like barbed wire stretched too taut. He did not pull his hand away, but he did not squeeze hers back either. He just let it be. He let her hand rest there, letting the warmth travel between their skin in the deep silence. The oil lamp flickered, its flame burning low, making the shadows in the room stretch long and thin. Outside, the lonely call of a coyote echoed through the dark hills, and another answered from somewhere farther off. Clara's thumb gently traced the thickest callus on his palm, that hard ridge of skin at the base of his forefinger, built from a lifetime of gripping tools and reins. She followed it slowly, feeling the years of hard work stored in that rough patch, like rings inside an old oak tree. She heard Silas take in a sharp, quiet breath. He turned his hand over, slow and careful, as if he were holding something fragile that might shatter, until his palm faced the ceiling, and her fingers settled into the curve of his hand. They just sat that way, until the lamp sputtered and finally went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. Clara could no longer see his face, but she could feel the warm, rough texture of his skin against hers. When she finally moved to stand and go to her room, he spoke her name. Clara. She paused by the bedroom door. I ain't one for... He trailed off, then tried to start over. Words have never been easy for me. I know, she said softly. But Another silence. Longer this time. The darkness hid his expression, but she could hear the weight in his voice. I am glad you are well again. Clara couldn't see him, but she understood everything hiding beneath those simple words, all the things he could not say, and maybe never would find the words for. I am glad too, she whispered back. She went into her bedroom and closed the door, leaning her back against the solid, rough-hewn wood. She stood there for a long time in the dark, her hand still feeling the warmth from where he had held it. Outside, the wind began to rise. The new curtain she had hung rustled against the window pane, making a soft, whispery sound, almost like someone breathing. And far off to the north, past the dark mountains in the high country where the wild cattle roamed, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the horizon. It felt like a warning. The heat came down like a blacksmith's hammer. Every morning, Clara woke up to air so heavy it felt like you could take a bite out of it. The little creek that ran behind the barn had dwindled down to a muddy trail. The cattle just stood bunched together under the shade of the few cottonwood trees, their sides heaving, too miserable from the heat to even think about grazing. Silas started riding out before the sun came up each day. He would saddle his bay mare in the pre-dawn grayness and head north, up toward the ridgeline. From the porch, Clara would watch him go, the coffee in her cup growing cold. He would come back hours later, dust settled deep in the lines on his face and a hard look in his eyes. What is it you're looking for out there? She finally asked him one evening. He was at the water pump, splashing cool water over his face and neck. It streamed down his collar, making dark patches on his shirt. He stood up straight, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. A wild herd, he said. Feral cattle. He gestured north toward the mountains, which stood like blue shadows against the pale sky. There are abandoned ranches up in that high country. Folks packed up and left during the lean years. But the cattle stayed, and they bred, and they went wild. Clara waited, knowing there was more. The drought is pushing them down from the high ground. They are coming down looking for water, for any patch of grass they can find. He shook his head, water dripping from his hair onto his shoulders. If they come pouring through this valley when a big storm hits... He trailed off. What happens then? She asked. They will stampede. 300 head of them, maybe more. They will mow down everything that gets in their way. Fences, crops, our own livestock. He looked straight at her. Houses, too. Clara's grip on the porch railing tightened. Cannot someone stop them? You do not stop them, you turn them. He reached for the towel hanging on a nail by the pump and began to dry his face. A person would have to ride right into the heart of them, get to the lead animals and push them toward the eastern basin. It is empty country out that way, nothing for them to destroy. A person. He did not reply. He just walked past her and went inside the house, and he did not say another word for the rest of the night. Over the next few days, there were more signs. Big clouds of dust appeared on the northern horizon. It was not the kind of dust kicked up by the wind. This was thicker, and it moved with a purpose. Clara would see it in the afternoons, a dark brown stain against the washed-out sky. Their own cattle became skittish. Instead of grazing, they just paced back and forth along the fence line. The milk cow kicked the bucket over twice. The chickens would not go into their coop to roost until it was fully dark. Silas took a ride out one afternoon and came back with his jaw clenched tight. He unsaddled the mare without a word, brushed her down without a word. He walked over to the porch where Clara was waiting for him and stopped on the bottom step. "How many?" she asked. 300, he said. "Maybe more." "How close are they? 2 days out? 3 at the most out?" He looked to the north, even though there was nothing to see from here but the rolling hills and the vast, empty sky. "There is a storm coming, too. I can smell it." Clara could not smell anything but dust and dry grass, but she did not question him. "What are we going to do?" "There is a meeting tomorrow, over at the Holloway place. Everybody is going." He came up the steps and stood beside her. For just a second, his hand lifted as if he was about to touch her arm or her shoulder or maybe her face. But then he let it fall back to his side. "Make some extra biscuits," he said. "We will bring them along." The Holloway barn was packed. Clara counted 15 people in all. They were ranchers and farmers whose homes were scattered all across the valley. They had weathered faces and worried eyes. They stood around in small groups between the big bales of hay and the empty stalls, their voices low and murmuring, until everyone went quiet when Silas walked in. Martha Holloway put a cup of water in Clara's hands. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "The way these men are carrying on, you would think the world was about to end." Ezra Holloway stood by the big barn doors with 2 other men Clara did not know, and their voices carried in the thick, still air. 300 head, at least, probably more. "They are coming down through Miller's Canyon. That is a straight shot, right to the valley floor. If that storm hits while they are on the run, there will not be a thing left standing." The whole barn went silent. All eyes turned toward the center of the room, where a single kerosene lantern hung from a nail, casting long, dancing shadows on the dirt floor. An older man with a gray beard and hands that looked like knotted rope was the first to speak. "We do not have enough men to turn a herd that size, not with us spread out the way we are." Another man, younger, spoke up. "What about the eastern basin? If we could just push them in that direction." "Push them how?" "Are you planning to ride into a stampede all by yourself?" the first man shot back. "There is not a soul here with that many ranch hands, and there is not a soul here who is that kind of crazy." The voices started to rise and overlap, a tangle of arguments and plans, with a current of fear running under it all. Clara watched Silas. He was standing off to the side of the group with his arms crossed over his chest, his face impossible to read. He had not said a single word since they got there. Ezra Holloway raised a hand, and the barn quieted down again. "I have seen men try to turn a stampede before," he said, his voice steady and flat. "I have seen them get buried for it, too." A heavy silence fell over the room. Beside Clara, Martha made a small sound, half a sigh and half a prayer. Then Silas uncrossed his arms and took a step forward. The lantern light fell on his face, and in that moment, Clara saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. It was not fear. It was something older and harder than that. It was acceptance. "I reckon I will do it." The words landed in the silence like stones dropped in a still pond. The gray-bearded man just shook his head. "By yourself, Silas? That is just—" "I know the canyons," Silas cut in. "I know how the cattle run. If I can get out ahead of them, turn the lead steers before they hit the valley floor, you will get yourself killed is what you will do." Silas just shrugged one shoulder. "Might." Ezra moved closer and put a weathered hand on Silas's arm. "Son, if you ride into that herd alone, you might not ride back out. Then I will not need burying." There was a beat of silence. "I do not aim to. Anyway," Martha's voice sliced through the tension in the barn. "Lord, that man has more stubbornness in his little finger than most people have in their entire body." A few of the men let out short, nervous laughs. The tension cracked a little, but it did not break. The meeting ended about an hour later. Plans were made, just in case. But everyone there knew the hard truth. Everything depended on one man, one horse, and a whole lot of luck. Clara found Silas outside by the barn. He was checking the cinch strap on his mare's saddle, his hands moving over the leather as if he were already getting ready. She walked right up and grabbed his arm. He stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. "You cannot go alone." Her voice sounded sharper than she had meant it to. "There has to be some other way." He just looked at her, the moonlight catching in his eyes. For a heartbeat, something in his expression changed, and she saw the fear he had kept hidden inside the barn. She saw the doubt and the awful weight of what he had just volunteered to do. "Somebody has to," he said simply. "Then let it be somebody else. There is not anybody else." He gently but firmly pulled his arm free from her grasp. "This is my job, Clara. This is what I have always done. I look after folks. I keep them safe." He paused for a moment. "The only thing that is different now is I have got something to come back to." He walked over to his horse, swung up into the saddle, and looked down at her. "That storm will hit tomorrow night, or maybe the night after." He gathered up the reins. "I will be back," he said. "That is a promise." And with that, he rode off into the darkness. Clara stood alone in the Holloway's yard and watched until he disappeared, until even the sound of his horse's hooves faded into nothing. Martha came and stood beside her and pressed a handkerchief into her hand. Clara had not even realized she was crying. "Come on inside, child," Martha said gently. "There is nothing to do now but wait and pray." Clara looked to the north. The stars were vanishing one by one behind clouds she could not yet see. The air felt different now, heavy and charged, like the whole sky was holding its breath. And somewhere out there under those darkening clouds, 300 head of wild cattle were on the move toward the valley. And somewhere in the space between here and there, her husband was riding by himself into the encroaching darkness. The storm broke right at dusk. Clara stood by the window watching the sky turn a sickly green, and then a bruised black. Jagged white lines of lightning tore the horizon apart. The thunder that followed was not a distant rumble, but a deep, jarring crash that shook dust from the rafters and made the window panes rattle in their frames. Then came the rain, not softly or gradually, but as a solid wall of water that slammed against the house like some living, furious thing. The windows trembled. The new curtain, Silas's lopsided curtain, swayed in the draft that found its way through every crack and seam in the old walls. He had ridden out an hour before. She had watched him saddle his mare in the eerie green light just before the storm hit. She had watched him check the cinch strap not once but twice, and then a third time. She watched him swing himself up into the saddle and point the horse north without a single backward glance. She had wanted to run out after him, to grab the reins and plead with him not to go, but she had not moved from the porch. Now she just pressed her forehead and stared out into the wild mess. Rain was coming down the window in sheets so heavy she could not see the barn, could not see the corral. She could not see a single thing except for water and blackness, and the bright flash of white light now and then that burned shapes into her vision for seconds after it was gone. The clock on the mantel ticked away, slow and steady and unstoppable. Clara moved over to the table and sat down. She wrapped both of her hands around a coffee cup that had turned cold a long time ago. She started thinking about New York, about the brownstone on Lexington Avenue. She pictured her bedroom with its rose-patterned wallpaper and the lace curtains her mother had special ordered from France. She thought about the suitors who would come to call on Sunday afternoons. They were all young men in freshly pressed suits with smiles they had practiced and compliments they had rehearsed. "Miss Ashford, you look divine this evening. Miss Ashford, might I have this dance?" So many words, pretty words, smooth words, words that just slid right off the tongue. Was all smooth talk, sweet as honey and meaning less than nothing. Not a single one of those men would ride headfirst into a storm for a stranger. None of them would risk their hide for neighbors they hardly knew. And none would lift a finger if it meant getting a wrinkle in their fine linen shirts or a scuff on their shiny boots. Lightning lit up the sky. Thunder cracked so hard the walls trembled, and the lamp chimney rattled on its base. Clara jumped. Coffee spilled over the edge of her cup, making a dark stain that spread across the table. She just left it there. The clock ticked on. 9 o'clock, then 10, then 11. Clara tried to pray. The words felt all wrong, just little pieces. Broken bits of hymns she half recalled from childhood Sundays in the family pew. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." Thunder swallowed the rest of it. The whole house shook. She tried again. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow." Lightning struck close, turning the whole room bone-white for a single heartbeat, then throwing it back into blackness. The shadow of... She could not remember the next part. The words just flew away and would not come back. Midnight. The storm gave no sign of letting up. Clara stood up. Her legs were stiff from sitting so long. She walked over to the window, then back to the table, then to the window again. Her boots made squishing sounds on the floorboards. She had tracked mud inside earlier and had not even noticed. She picked up the coffee cup, set it down, and then picked it up again. She counted the knots in the wood of the table. 7. The same as always. The same as the very first night she sat right here, all alone, wondering what kind of man she had gone and married. She counted them one more time. 7, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Her hands just would not stop shaking. She pressed them down flat against the tabletop. They trembled anyway. She pressed them against her thighs. Her legs started shaking too. She thought about that wild herd. 300 cattle, maybe more, running blind in the storm, their hooves sounding like thunder. On the canyon floor, the whites of their eyes showing in pure terror. She pictured Silas riding right into the middle of them. Just one man, one horse, a coat to wave, and a voice to yell. That was all he had between him and all that crushing weight. She thought about those hooves, about him falling, about the mud churned up by hundreds of panicked animals. Her stomach turned over. She barely made it to the door, got it open, and reached the edge of the porch before her knees gave out and everything inside her came up. She was sick right into the pouring rain. Coffee and sour bile and nothing more. She had not eaten a bite since that morning. Her body retched again and again, until there was nothing left and she was just heaving air, her whole body shaking with the effort. The rain soaked through her dress in seconds. Her hair was plastered to her face and her neck. Water ran into her eyes and mouth, and she could not tell if she was crying or if it was just the storm pulling her apart, piece by piece. She tried to get to her feet. Her foot slipped on the wet boards. She went down hard, hitting her knees first, then her hands, before the rest of her slid right off the porch and tumbled into the mud below. The mud was cold and thick, black as pitch in the darkness. It swallowed her hands clear up to the wrists when she tried to catch herself. It soaked through her skirt and her petticoats, pressing against her skin like some hungry thing. Clara tried to push herself up. Her arm shook and then gave out. Her face fell into the mud, her cheek, her mouth. The grit was thick and awful against her lips. She just laid there, The rain beat down on her back. The mud sucked at her clothes, her hair, her skin. She could feel it getting into places mud had no business being, coating her, claiming her. She was Clara Ashford from the New York Ashfords. She had attended the cotillion. She had danced with the sons of senators and the heirs of railroads. She had worn silk gloves and pearl earrings and dresses that cost more than most folks earned in a whole year. And now she was lying face down in the mud behind a ranch house in the middle of nowhere, covered in filth, crying like a little girl, unable to stand, unable to stop. Pathetic. The word just appeared in her mind. Her mother's voice, her mother's sharp judgment. Pathetic. She did not even try to get up again. What was the use? Silas was out there somewhere in the dark, probably dead already. Or maybe dying, trampled under all those hooves, his bones breaking in the black mud, just like hers felt like they were breaking now. And she was here, completely useless, helpless, unable to do a single thing except lie in the dirt and wait for news she did not want to hear. Some adventure this was, some grand escape from the life her mother had all planned out. She laughed. The sound came out ugly, like a bark that got lost in the thunder and the rain. She did not know how long she stayed there. It could have been minutes or hours. It was long enough for the cold to get deep into her bones and settle in like it planned to stay. It was long enough for the shaking to finally stop because her body had nothing left to shake with. At last, she started crawling back, toward the porch, through the mud that tried to hold her, up the steps, on her hands and knees, leaving dark smears on every board she touched, and through the door she had left wide open. She collapsed right there on the kitchen floor. She did not change her clothes, and she did not wash. She just laid there on the floorboards with mud drying on her face and in her hair and between her fingers, staring up at the ceiling while the storm raged on outside. The clock ticked on. 4 o'clock. 5. A gray light started to creep through the windows. The rain had stopped. Clara could not remember when the thunder had faded into distant rumbles. The wind had died down to something that was almost quiet. She pushed herself up. Her entire body screamed in protest. Her dress was stiff with dried mud, and it cracked when she moved. Her hair hung in tangled ropes around her face. She walked to the porch, grabbed the quilt off the chair, and wrapped it around her shoulders without caring one bit about the mud she was smearing all over it. The air outside smelled like wet sage and turned earth. Puddles had formed in every low spot in the yard. The mud was thick and dark, scarred with little channels where the water had cut its own paths. Clara just stared at the northern horizon. Gray sky, gray land, and nothing was moving. Minutes went by. The light grew stronger. And then she saw it. A shape in the mist. A horse and a rider. Moving slow, way too slow. Clara was off that porch before she even knew her legs had decided to run. Her feet were bare. She had lost her boots somewhere in the night. She splashed through puddles. Mud splattered up her legs. She did not feel a thing. The shape got clearer. It was the bay mare, lathered and stumbling. And on her back was Silas, slumped forward over the horse's neck, his hands tangled in her mane instead of holding the reins. He was not sitting, just clinging on. Clara grabbed the bridle. The mare stopped, her sides heaving, her eyes rolling. Silas. He lifted his head. His face was gray underneath all the dirt. His eyes could barely focus. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, and under the ripped fabric she could see raw red skin, glistening and wet. He tried to get down, swung one leg over and slid down the mare's side. His knees buckled the second his boots touched the ground. Clara caught him. His whole weight slammed right into her and nearly sent her down into the mud again. She locked her knees, planted her feet, and held on with all her might. He smelled like rain and sweat and horse and blood. "You are alive," she said. Her voice cracked on the third word. "You are alive." His forehead dropped against her shoulder. His whole body started to shake. For the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, Silas Drifter let himself be held. Clara half carried him across the yard. His arm hung heavy over her shoulders. His boots dragged through the mud, leaving 2 long furrows behind them. She could not feel her own legs anymore, just the heavy weight of him pressing her down. The strain in her lower back, the desperate need to keep, just trying to keep moving. Those porch steps felt like climbing a mountain. She wrestled him up one at a time. Silas tried his best to help, lifting a boot, setting it back down, then trying again. His hand dug into her shoulder, a grip tight enough to leave a dark bruise behind. They finally tumbled inside. Clara eased him down into the wooden chair next to the big iron stove. His head dropped back with a thud, his eyes shutting right away. His whole chest shook with every rough, ragged breath he took. Clara didn't even pause to think. She wrestled his soaked coat off, fighting sleeves that were stuck to his arms like a coat of paint. His shirt was drenched clean through and torn wide open at the shoulder, where she'd already seen the angry, glistening flesh. Her fingers trembled as she undid the buttons and peeled the wet cloth away from his skin. The rope burn was a sight worse than she had imagined. An angry stripe of red and purple cut a path from his shoulder clear across his chest. You could see the mark where a lariat had been cinched down too tight, pulled too hard against a man's desperate weight. Blisters had already bubbled up along the edges and popped. Some of the skin was gone, altogether leaving behind raw patches that oozed a clear fluid. But his hands were the worst of it. She turned them over gently in her own, and her stomach twisted into a knot. His palms looked like raw meat from the butcher shop. They were torn up and bloody. The skin had been peeled off in long strips, showing the swollen flesh underneath. Clara hurried to the bedroom and snatched the wool blanket, wrapping it around his shaking shoulders. She stoked the fire until the old cast-iron stove started to glow, pouring waves of welcome heat into the little room. Then she worked the pump handle, filling a basin with water, which she set on the stovetop to heat. She found the cleanest rag she owned and went to work on his hands first. Silas never made a sound. His jaw muscle jumped when the warm water touched the raw skin. She could see it twitching right under his stubble, but he didn't so much as flinch. She cleaned out all the grit and the dried blood and whatever else had gotten caked in there during that long, hard night. Then she tore strips from her own petticoat and wrapped his palms, making them snug enough to stay put but leaving them loose enough to let the wounds get some air. The gash on his chest was next. She worked just the same, moving slow and careful, cleaning every inch. The skin around it was hot to the touch and an angry red color, but she didn't see any sign of infection setting in. Not yet, anyway. When she was all done, she put on a pot of coffee, making it strong and black, just the way he liked it. She carefully pressed the warm cup into his bandaged hands and watched him take that first sip. A little bit of color started to creep back into his face. The awful gray washed out and he started to look like a living man again. His breathing finally slowed down and got steady. Clara dragged the other chair over and sat right across from him. Her own dress was still stiff with dried mud. Her hair was hanging in tangled knots around her face. She hadn't washed, she hadn't changed, she hadn't done a single thing but pour all her energy into keeping him alive. "Biscuits," she said out loud. "I ought to make some biscuits." "You need something in your stomach. Stay." It was just one word, but the way he said it, well, it stopped her, right in her tracks. She sat back down in her chair. Silas was looking at her over the top of that coffee cup. His eyes were a whole lot clearer now, and they were focused right on her. He took another long swallow, then set the cup on his knee, cradling it between his bandaged hands. "You look like you've been wrestling a hog in the mud," he said. The sound that came out of Clara was half a laugh and half a sob. "I fell off the porch, straight into the mud. Why? I was—" She couldn't get the words out. Her throat felt tight as a drum. She tried again. "I was scared. I thought you weren't coming back home. I thought—" She just couldn't finish the sentence. The words were stuck. Silas just nodded his head. Like that was all the answer he needed. Like he understood every last thing she was trying to say. He drank some more of his coffee. Clara watched his throat as he swallowed. She watched the steam rise up from the cup, and she just waited. "Found him in the canyon," he said at last. His voice was all gravel, scraped raw. He was already on the run when I caught up. That lightning had him spooked something fierce. 300 head of cattle moving like a single terrified beast, all of them just blind with fear. Clara didn't say a word. She didn't want to break his stride. This was more words than he'd strung together in all the weeks she'd been there. I rode right into the middle of them. He shook his head real slow. Had my coat off, waving it around my head, just yelling my lungs out. I was trying to turn the lead steers before the whole lot of them poured out onto the valley floor. He stopped talking, just stared down at a spot on the floorboards. They didn't want to turn. They just kept pushing south, heading for the ranches and the farms. Heading for... He stopped and swallowed hard. Heading for here. Clara's hand squeezed the wooden seat of her chair so tight the edges dug into her palms. I finally got ahead of him. The mayor knows that Country Pa trained her mother on those same trails. She found a way through a side canyon, got us out in front of the whole herd. We pushed the leaders to the east. The rest of them just followed. He finally looked up at her. They're herd animals. That's what they do. They follow the ones out front, even if it's into nowhere, even onto empty land where there's nothing for them to tear apart. How long were you out there? Hours. I don't rightly know how many. I lost count after the first couple. He looked down at his bandaged hands. My horse stumbled at one point. She went down hard on her front knees. I managed to roll clear. Their hooves missed my head by... He held up 2 fingers, barely an inch apart. That much, maybe even less. Clara felt her stomach do a flip. I got back on her and kept going. He said it just like he was talking about mending a fence post. Simple as that. The storm finally broke right around dawn. The herd calmed down in the basin. They were worn out and scared, but they were settled. He took another sip of coffee. Then I rode back. And that's all there was to it. That's all. Like it was nothing at all. Like he hadn't just ridden all alone into a stampede in the dead of night. Like he hadn't nearly been trampled to death by 300 panicked cattle. "You could have been killed," Clara said. He just nodded. "Why?" That one question just hung there in the air between them. Silas didn't answer right away. He stared at a spot just past her shoulder, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite get down. "Somebody had to do it," he said finally. "That is not an answer. It's the only one I've got." "No." Clara's voice came out sharper than she meant for it to. "You rode into a stampede by yourself in a thunderstorm for a bunch of people who barely even know your name. Why?" Silas set his coffee cup down on the floor. His bandaged hands just rested on his knees. He looked right at her. I mean, really looked at her. And she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't pride. It was something quieter, something that had been there the whole time, just buried deep under all that silence. Pa used to say. He stopped, and then started over. "You protect what's yours, even if it costs you." He paused for a second. "Especially if it costs you. But those people aren't yours. The Holloways, the Fentons, all the rest of them. They're just your neighbors. Neighbors are what I've got." He looked down at his torn-up hands again. "For 3 years, all I've had is neighbors in this land and not a whole lot else worth counting." Clara pushed herself to her feet. Her legs felt stiff. Her whole body was aching in places she never knew could ache. The dried mud on her dress cracked and flaked off with every little move she made. She walked across the small space between them and knelt down right beside his chair. The floor was cold and hard against her knees. She didn't even care. Silas. He looked down at her. He was just waiting. "I came out here looking for something different, something that wasn't New York City, something that wasn't my mother's grand plans for me, and wasn't a long line of suitors with their pretty words and their empty promises." She took a deep breath and let it all out. "I thought I wanted some man from a storybook, somebody who would come and sweep me off my feet with big fancy gestures and beautiful speeches." His face never changed. He just sat there and listened. "But that's not what I found here." Her voice started to shake, but she let it. "I found a man who makes coffee for me before I even wake up. A man who hangs curtains all crooked because he never learned how to sew, but he tried to anyway. A man who reads the Bible out loud to a sick woman for 4 days straight because he doesn't know what else in the world to do." Her hand found his, her fingers resting on his bandaged palm. "I found a man who rides straight into a stampede for his neighbors, who nearly dies for strangers, who does what needs to be done and never once asks for a word of thanks." Silas's breath hitched in his throat. "I'm not going back to New York," Clara said. "I'm not leaving. I'm staying right here. Not as some business arrangement, not just as a name on a piece of paper. I'm staying as your wife, for real this time, if you'll have me." He didn't answer her with any words. His hand moved real slow, like he wasn't sure, and came to rest on her hair. It was as light as a bird landing on a branch. His fingers were trembling against her head. She leaned into his touch and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she saw his face was wet with tears. She had never seen this man cry. She didn't even think he could. "You scared me half to death," she whispered up at him. His mouth twitched into something that was almost a smile. Only half. The other half was too angry to be scared. And then he did smile. It was a small, fragile thing, like something that hadn't been used in a long, long time. Clara pushed up from her knees and sat on the arm of his chair. His arm came around her waist, gentle as could be, careful of his wounds and careful of her. She leaned her head against his shoulder. They just stayed like that while the fire burned down to glowing embers, while the morning light grew stronger through those crooked curtains. They stayed like that while the world outside started to slowly dry and warm up and come back to life again. "Clara, I ain't good with words. I never have been, and I probably never will be. I know, but I—" He stopped and swallowed hard. "I'm sure glad you stayed." She turned her head and pressed her lips against his temple. She could taste the salt and the dirt and something underneath it all that was just him. "So am I." Outside, they heard the sound of wagon wheels turning in the muddy track, voices calling out, and the snorting of horses. The neighbors were coming. 2 weeks later, the wagons started showing up at dawn. Clara stood on the porch and counted them. 1, 2, 5, 8 of them. They rolled up the muddy track in a long, slow line. The wagon wheels cut fresh ruts into the soft earth. Men sat on the benches holding their tools across their laps. They brought hammers and saws and levels and coils of thick rope. Women rode beside them holding baskets covered up with checkered cloth. Martha Holloway's wagon was the first to pull up. She climbed right down before Ezra had even brought the horses to a full stop. Stopped the horses and marched across the yard like a general looking over a battlefield. "Well," she said, looking at the small ranch house, the weathered barn, and the fence line that was still in need of mending, "we have got work to do." Clara stood on the porch in her cleanest dress, the dove gray one with the mother-of-pearl buttons, all washed and pressed. The mud was finally scrubbed out of the hem. "I do not understand. What is all this, a house raising?" Martha's eyes crinkled up at the corners. "Ezra told folks what your husband did, riding into that stampede all by himself, turning 300 head in the pitch dark." She shook her head slowly. "Word gets around fast out here. Folks wanted to do something, but we did not ask for anything. Of course you did not. And that man of yours would not ask for a glass of water if he was dying of thirst in the desert?" Martha patted Clara's arm. "That is exactly why we did not wait for you to ask." The men unloaded lumber from the wagons, fresh-cut boards that still smelled of pine sap and sawdust. They took all the lumber to a flat piece of ground about 50 yards from the old house, a spot Clara had never given a second thought. It had good drainage, got the full morning sun, and had plenty of room for a future. Silas came out of the barn. His hands were still wrapped up, but the wounds had finally scabbed over enough for him to hold a hammer without flinching. He stopped at the edge of the yard, just looking at the growing stack of wood, at the men setting up sawhorses, and at the women laying out blankets in the shade of a big cottonwood. Ezra Holloway moseyed over to him, put a weathered hand on Silas's shoulder, and said something Clara couldn't make out from the porch. Silas just shook his head. Ezra tried again. Silas shook his head once more. Then Ezra just pushed a hammer into his bandaged hands, pointed toward the lumber pile, and walked off without looking for an answer. Silas just stood there for a good long while. The hammer dangled by his side. You could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. His shoulders were all bunched up. Then he walked over to that lumber pile and started sorting boards. Clara watched it all from the porch. She watched the other men circle around him, not asking for orders, just falling into a rhythm like they'd done this 100 times. She watched them let him take the lead. This board goes here, that beam over there, the frame coming up piece by piece with him guiding the way. He didn't say much, just pointed and nodded or shook his head when a thing wasn't quite right, but they followed him all the same. They listened to his quietness, the same way Clara had learned to. By noon, the skeleton of a house was standing against that big blue Texas sky. 4 walls, no roof yet, not a single window, just the bones of something that was about to be real. The fresh-cut pines seemed to catch the sunlight and glowed like pale gold against the dark hills in the distance. Martha appeared right at Clara's elbow with a glass of water. "See, I told you. You just stand by him long enough, he'll find his way right." Clara took the glass and took a drink. The water was cool and tasted clean. "I think maybe we found our way together." Martha smiled, and the lines around her eyes crinkled up in that familiar way. "Well now, honey, that's how it's supposed to be, ain't it?" The sun started to dip low toward the western hills. The men just kept on working, the younger fellas on the framing, the older ones directing things. Everybody moving with that easy pace of folks who knew this work, and knew they would do it again for the next neighbor. Clara helped the women lay out all the food on long tables someone had thrown together from sawhorses and spare planks. There was fried chicken, biscuits, beans, and 3 kinds of pie that Mrs. Patterson had magically whipped up, though she'd never share the recipe with a soul. Clara fixed a plate and carried it over to Silas. He was standing by the half-finished wall, checking a crossbeam with a practiced eye. He took the plate from her without a word. He ate standing right there, the food vanishing in quick, businesslike bites. He handed the empty plate back to her. "That's good chicken," he said. "Mrs. Patterson made it." "That figures." It wasn't much, but his hand grazed hers. When he gave back the plate, his fingers lingered just a heartbeat too long, calloused skin on calloused skin. Then he turned right back to that crossbeam and picked up his hammer. The neighbors all headed home around dusk. You could hear the wagon wheels groaning down the dirt track. Voices called out their goodbyes across the yard as it got dark. Their lanterns bobbed in the twilight, looking like fireflies drifting back to their own homes. Clara stood in the space that would one day be their parlor. The frame of the house rose up all around her, just raw wood, freshly cut, smelling of pine and what-ifs. No walls, no roof, just the outline of rooms appearing out of thin air. She walked through them real slow, her boots making no sound on the packed dirt floor. This one would be the kitchen. She could tell by the extra bracing for the heavy stove they'd have to get. This one here was the bedroom, bigger than the old one. Room enough for a real bed instead of that little cot she'd been sleeping on. She paused in a smaller room just off the main one. 4 walls were roughed in. A single window opening faced east, right where the morning sun would pour in. It was just big enough for a cradle, a rocking chair, and things that might find their way there later. She heard footsteps behind her. She knew the sound of his boots by now. Silas stopped right in the doorway, his bandaged hands just hanging at his sides. He looked at the little room, then at Clara standing in the middle of it, her hand resting on the rough-cut lumber. "Thinking?" he asked. "Imagining." He gave a small nod. He glanced around at the bare frame, the exposed beams, and the sky peeking through where a roof ought to be. "Needs work. Everything does." The corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was closer than she'd seen in weeks, closer than she ever thought she might see again. He crossed the short distance between them. His hand found hers. Their fingers laced together, his rough and wrapped in cloth. Hers now calloused from weeks of work that would have made her mother plumb faint. They just stood there inside the skeleton of their future and didn't say about a single thing. The words weren't needed anymore. The old house felt smaller now that Clara had walked through the outline of the new one. Smaller, but it didn't feel sad. It just felt ready to be something else. A storage shed, perhaps, or a bunkhouse for hired hands, if they were ever lucky enough to have any. She sat on the porch with Silas, their backs leaning against the old, weathered boards. They both looked out at the new frame, standing ghostly pale in the moonlight. The night air was cool. The stars were scattered across the black sky like someone had spilled salt on a dark tablecloth. Clara reached into her pocket, pulled out a letter envelope, and set it on her knee. Silas glanced at it. "What's that?" "It's the money from New York. I brought it with me when I came." She turned the envelope over and over in her hand. The paper was soft and worn from being handled so much. "It was my emergency fund in case things went sour, in case I needed a ticket back home." He didn't say anything, just sat there and waited. "I want to use it for the roof and the windows, and whatever else we're going to need." She held the envelope out to him. "For us." He looked from the envelope back to her face, the moonlight catching something in his eyes. "That's yours." It was. She pressed it firmly into his bandaged hands. "Now it's ours." He held that envelope for a long time. He didn't open it. He didn't try to count the money inside. He just held it, like it weighed a whole lot more than just paper and ink. Then he carefully set it on the porch rail next to him and put his arm around her shoulders. Clara leaned right into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body next to hers, smelling wood smoke and honest sweat and something underneath it all that was just him. It was familiar now after all this time. Familiar and good. A coyote cried out somewhere in the dark hills, a high and lonesome sound. Another one answered from even further off. "Clara, I'm glad you stayed." She rested her head against his shoulder. "I'm glad you gave me a reason to." A quiet settled between them, the good kind, the kind that holds things instead of hiding them. "I'm still not much for talking," he said after a bit. "I know. I probably won't ever change. I know that too." "And you're all right with that?" Clara looked up at him. The moonlight lit up his face, that strong jaw, the weathered skin, and the eyes that had learned to say all the things his mouth couldn't, tired, worn, and hers. "It turns out I'm just learning a new language." His arm tightened around her shoulders. "And I'm still a terrible cook," she added. "Your biscuits are getting better. That's not saying much." A long pause, long enough for another coyote to call out in the night. "No," he said finally, "it ain't." She laughed. The sound of it surprised her. How easy it came out, how right it felt. He made a sound back that might have been a laugh itself, all rusty and out of practice, like a piece of machinery that hadn't been run in years. They sat there on the porch of that old little house and just watched the moonlight fall on the bones of the new one. Tomorrow would bring more work, more neighbors showing up with lumber and nails, more walls rising up and more rooms taking shape. The roof would come next, then the windows, then all the rest of it. A home being built board by board, day by day, by hands that had finally learned to work as one. But tonight, there was only this. Just two people who had found one another in the quiet spaces, who had learned to speak without needing words, and who had started building something that neither one of them had ever expected. Not when she first stepped off that stagecoach into the dust of Sagebrush Hollow. Clara's head came to rest on his shoulder. His chin settled into her hair. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. Sometimes a story just settles in a quiet place, somewhere between your heart and your throat, and it just stays there for a while. This one might do just that. The picture of two people sitting on a porch in the moonlight, watching the frame of a house they'll build together. The meaning behind all the words that were never said but somehow spoke everything that truly mattered. A lot of us have known that kind of quiet, haven't we? The kind that isn't empty, but is actually full of everything. We've stood next to someone and realized that love doesn't always show up like it does in the stories, with big speeches and fancy promises. Sometimes it shows up in a cup of coffee left warming on the stove, or in curtains that are hung a little crooked, but were hung with care, or in hands that just reach across a table in the dark. Maybe you've had a love like that yourself, a love that didn't make a big announcement, a moment when you understood that the person beside you had been talking to you all along, just in a language you hadn't learned to speak yet. It's all right to let this story rest easy now. It doesn't have to be anything more than what it was. A quiet story about two people who found each other in the silence between words. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for staying till the end. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.